Some crimes are designed to be forgotten, buried under official statements, diluted by time, and quietly accepted as resolved, even when the answers never truly come, and when you look closely, what remains is not clarity, but a carefully constructed silence. In the Middle East, a region where power, influence, and visibility often collide, there are cases involving globally recognized figures whose stories did not end with closure, but with contradictions, missing pieces, and questions that no authority has fully answered, no matter how much time has passed. These are not obscure disappearances or unknown victims. These are individuals whose faces were everywhere, on television, in newspapers followed millions. People whose lives were documented in detail, yet whose final moments remained disturbingly unclear. As if the closer the world tried to look, the less it was allowed to see. What makes these cases truly unsettling is not just what happened, but what never happened. Investigations that stopped too soon. Conclusions that failed to convince, and narratives that seemed complete on the surface, but began to fall apart the moment they were questioned with any depth. And when you begin to connect the dots, not just within each case, but between them, a deeper discomfort starts to emerge. Because the inconsistencies are not isolated, they repeat themselves in different forms, across different countries, involving different people, yet leaving behind the same lingering feeling that something essential is missing. In this video we are going to headlines, examining cases that continue to spark debate, suspicion, and unanswered theories. Stories of famous individuals whose fates remain surrounded by doubt, where the official version is only one of many, and not necessarily the most convincing one. Because sometimes the truth is not erased. It is simply buried beneath layers that most people never question. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that these crimes were never meant to be fully understood. In October 2018, a man walked into a building and never walked out again. And what makes this moment so disturbing is not just the disappearance itself, but the fact that it happened in one of the most controlled and monitored environments possible. A consulate, a place that, in theory, should offer protection, not become the center of a global mystery. Jamal Khashoggi was not an unknown figure. He was a journalist with decades of experience, a former insider who had become increasingly critical of the Saudi government, and someone whose voice carried weight far beyond the region, especially after he began writing for major international outlets, where his opinions reached a global audience. On the day he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, he was there for something routine, documents related to his upcoming marriage, a detail that makes everything that followed feel even more surreal. Because there was no indication that this visit would become his last known moment alive. When hours passed and he did not reappear, concern quickly turned into alarm. And what initially seemed like a disappearance soon escalated into one of the most scrutinized cases in recent history, drawing attention from governments, intelligence agencies, and media organizations around the world. Official statements in the early days were inconsistent, shifting from denial to partial acknowledgement, and then to explanations that raised more questions than they answered, with reports suggesting that a team had arrived at the consulate shortly before Khashoggi entered, a detail that intensified suspicions about what may have been planned in advance. As investigations unfolded, fragments of information began to surface. Surveillance footage, travel records, and intelligence leaks that painted a fragmented picture of what might have happened inside that building. Yet despite the volume of attention and the international pressure, a complete and universally accepted version of events never fully emerged. What remains especially unsettling is the contrast between visibility and uncertainty, because this was not a crime hidden in isolation. It occurred under the watch of cameras, in a major city, involving diplomatic premises, and still, the full sequence of events. Every detail, every decision, every moment remains partially obscured. Over time, various conclusions were presented, some pointing to high-level involvement, others attempting to frame it as an operation that spiraled out of control. But none of them managed to eliminate the underlying sense that key elements of the story are still missing, either undisclosed, inaccessible, or deliberately withheld. And this is where the case transcends a single incident and becomes something larger, a reflection of how even the most visible crimes, involving well-known figures and global scrutiny, can remain unresolved in ways that feel deeply unsatisfying, leaving behind not just a narrative, but a persistent question. Because if something like this can happen in a place designed to be secure to someone the world was watching and still not be fully clarified, then it forces a much broader and more uncomfortable realization that visibility does not guarantee truth and attention does not always lead to answers. In March 2018, a video began to circulate online, recorded in secrecy, showing a woman speaking directly to the camera with a level of urgency that immediately set it apart from anything typical. And what made it even more striking was not just what she said, but who she was. Princess Latifa, the daughter of Dubai's ruler Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, appeared in that recording describing a life that, from the outside, seemed defined by privilege, but from her perspective was controlled, restricted, and impossible to escape. And she claimed that what she was about to do could either lead to her freedom, or to consequences she fully expected would follow. According to the timeline that later emerged, Latifa had carefully planned her escape, coordinating with a small group of people, leaving Dubai by car, crossing into Oman, and eventually boarding a yacht that would take her into international waters, where she believed she would finally be beyond reach. For a brief moment, it seemed like the plan had worked. As the yacht moved across the Indian Ocean, heading toward India, carrying with it not just a passenger, but a story that, if completed, would have raised serious questions about power, control, and personal freedom within one of the most closely watched royal families in the region. But then, everything stopped. Reports soon surfaced that the yacht had been intercepted near the coast of India, in an operation involving armed forces, and from that point forward, the clarity of what happened begins to dissolve into conflicting accounts, limited footage, and official statements that did little to settle the growing uncertainty. For months, there was almost complete silence regarding Latifa's condition or whereabouts, and the absence of verified information only intensified the situation as human rights organizations, journalists, and observers began to question whether her attempt to escape had been forcibly reversed, and under what circumstances she was being held. Later, carefully released images and brief appearances attempted to suggest that she was safe, that the situation had been misunderstood, and that she was living under normal conditions. But these moments raised as many doubts as they tried to resolve, because they lacked context, continuity, and independent verification. What makes this case especially complex is the contrast between the public narrative and the fragments that contradict it. Because on one side, there is an official version that presents stability and control, while on the other, there is a sequence of events that suggests urgency, fear, and a desperate attempt to leave everything behind. And unlike many cases, where the mystery lies in a single moment, here the uncertainty extends over time because the central question is not only what happened during the interception, but what has happened since, behind closed doors, away from cameras, in a space where very little can be independently confirmed. This transforms the story from a single incident into an ongoing question, one that continues to evolve, because without consistent, transparent access to the truth, every new piece of information feels incomplete. As if it is only revealing part of a much larger picture that remains hidden. And once again, it reinforces a pattern that is becoming harder to ignore, where high-profile individuals, surrounded by visibility and influence, can still become the center of narratives that are tightly controlled, carefully managed, and never fully explained. In October 2017, a car exploded on a quiet road in Malta, and within seconds, one of the most prominent investigative journalists in Europe was gone, leaving behind not just a devastating scene, but a case that would quickly spiral into layers of complexity, controversy, and unanswered questions that remain difficult to untangle even today. Daphne Caruana Galizia was widely known for her relentless reporting on corruption, money laundering, and political misconduct, often exposing connections that reached into the highest levels of power. And because of that, she had spent years under pressure, facing threats, lawsuits, and constant attempts to silence her work. On the day of the explosion, she had just left her home, and according to those close to her, she had been actively working on multiple investigations, some of which were believed to involve influential figures both within Malta and beyond, making the timing of the attack feel anything but random. The immediate aftermath triggered a massive response, not only within Malta, but across Europe, as journalists, organizations, and international bodies demanded accountability, transparency, and a full investigation into who was responsible, and more importantly, who may have ordered such a precise and targeted act. Over time, arrests were made, suspects were identified, and certain elements of the operation began to surface, suggesting that this was not an isolated act of violence, but something far more organized, involving planning, coordination, and resources that pointed beyond a single individual. However, even with these developments, the case never reached a point of complete clarity, because while some participants were brought into the spotlight, the broader network, the possible motivations at higher levels, and the full chain of responsibility remained partially obscured, leaving gaps that continue to fuel speculation and concern. What makes this case particularly relevant in the context of unresolved crimes is not the absence of progress, but the incompleteness of the outcome. Because, despite years of investigation, public pressure, and international attention, there is still no universally accepted understanding of the full picture. And when a journalist known for exposing hidden truths becomes the center of a story that itself remains partially hidden, the situation takes on an almost paradoxical dimension, where the pursuit of transparency ends in a narrative that still lacks it. It also reinforces a recurring element seen in other high-profile cases, where visibility does not necessarily prevent ambiguity, and where even extensive investigations can leave behind unanswered questions, especially when the circumstances intersect with power, influence, and sensitive information. In the end, what remains is not just the memory of a crime, but the persistence of doubt, because until every layer is fully uncovered, every connection clearly established, and every motive thoroughly explained, the story continues to exist in that uncertain space between what is known and what is still hidden. When you place these cases side by side, not as isolated, but as part of a broader pattern, something begins to shift in the way they are perceived. Because while each story unfolds in a different country, under different circumstances, involving different individuals, the similarities are difficult to ignore once they are viewed through the same lens. In each case, the person at the center was not only well known, but also connected, informed, and, in some way, positioned close to structures of power, whether through journalism, royalty, or political exposure, which immediately raises the question of whether their visibility made them safer or, paradoxically, more vulnerable. Another recurring element is the presence of controlled narratives, situations where the official version of events exists, but is either incomplete, inconsistent, or challenged by alternative accounts that never fully disappear, creating a dual reality where multiple interpretations coexist, but none manage to fully dominate or resolve the uncertainty. There is also a noticeable pattern in how information emerges, not as a clear, continuous flow, but in fragments, leaks, delayed reports, and partial disclosures that seem to reveal just enough to maintain public awareness, while never offering a complete, transparent picture that would bring definitive closure. And perhaps more importantly, there is the question of limitation, not necessarily in terms of evidence, but in terms of access, because in all of these cases, there are boundaries that cannot be crossed by journalists, investigators, or the public. Invisible lines that define how far the truth can be pursued before it becomes restricted, classified, or simply unreachable. This creates an environment where theories naturally begin to form. Not always, because people are searching for sensational explanations, but because the available information does not fully account for what happened, leaving gaps that demand to be filled even if the answers remain speculative. Some theories focus on direct involvement from powerful individuals or institutions, suggesting that these events were not random or accidental, but deliberate actions designed to control narratives, eliminate risks, or send implicit messages, while others propose more complex scenarios, where multiple actors and motivations intersect in ways that are difficult to fully map. At the same time, there are also attempts to frame these cases as contained incidents, situations where responsibility lies within a limited group, disconnected from broader systems, which, while plausible on the surface, often struggle to explain the scale, coordination, or aftermath that follows. And this tension between limited explanations and expansive theories is precisely what keeps these stories unresolved. Because without full transparency, without unrestricted investigation, and without access to every layer of information, certainty becomes almost impossible to achieve. What ultimately emerges is not a single conclusion, but a pattern of ambiguity, where high-profile individuals become part of narratives that are tightly managed, partially revealed, and never entirely closed, leaving behind a lingering sense that the truth exists, but only in fragments scattered across versions that do not fully align. And once that pattern becomes visible, it changes the way each individual case is understood, because it suggests that the mystery is not just about what happened in each story, but about the conditions that allow these stories to remain unresolved in the first place.